Hello, everyone. I am Sarah, and I'm an event planner at the Orange County Library System. And I want to welcome you to our event, Meet the Authors, Queer Characters Across Genre Fiction. I just have to say one thing real quick. This project was made possible in part by the Institute of Museum and Library Services. We have 5 authors here today, 4 authors maybe. We're having some connection issues. And I'll go ahead and bring them on the screen and let them introduce themselves, and we'll get started. So hello, hi, everyone.
Hello.
All right, I'm going to say goodbye. I'll be here, but it's your show now.
Well, good afternoon. I'm Riley Scott, and I'm joined here today by some incredible authors who write queer characters in a variety of genres. We'll get into those genres and introductions shortly, but as a group, we're the Feisty Foes, and today we're going to talk about creating strong, relatable queer characters. We're really excited to be here with you all, so thank you for having us. And to get started, can everyone give us a bit of a brief intro and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you write? You want to start, Elle?
Sure. Hi, I'm Elle E. I am a bisexual author of science fiction and urban fantasy romance novels for DSP Publications. I have 4 novels out currently, Vicious Circle, which is a standalone, and the Stormfronts trilogy. And I have 4 more coming in the next 11 months, including a 3-book urban fantasy series called Nearly Departed and another standalone called Real to Real Love. That's me.
Hi, I'm Anne Laughlin. Glad to be here today. And I am I write crime fiction, and I have 7 novels out with Bold Strokes Books. My most recent was Money Creek, was released last September. And all of my books are standalone novels. I haven't tackled a series yet. What else about me? I write reviews for the Lambda Literary Review, so that's kind of using a little different writing muscle there. And I really enjoy writing retreats, so I've been all over the country on writing residencies over the years. Just is one of the nicer parts of the writing life, is going away and concentrating on your writing. So that's me. Thanks.
MB?
Sorry. Hey, I'm hoping that my internet connection will stay up. I'm MB Austin. I use she, her pronouns. My thrillers are the Maji Rios thrillers. Wait, what side of me am I on? They're about a contemporary counterterrorism covert operator who really never gets a vacation despite trying. And they have a strong romantic subplot in them. I also write in speculative fiction, mostly in steampunk with the Trencati Tales. It's an alternate history, genderqueer 1850s in the Mediterranean. And I have a mystery in progress right now. Blur's Day's Revenge will come from Bywater Books in 2022.
Hi, everyone. I'm Meredith Doench. I'm a queer writer who lives in Dayton, Ohio. I teach at the University of Dayton, and I write lesbian crime thrillers. I have a series, 3 books so far, that have come out under the Luce Hansen thriller series about a special agent with the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation. And so each book, she focuses on serial killers or catching serial killers. So each one has a crime in it. But I do have a new book coming out in March that will have new characters, new places, all of that.
Awesome. And I'm Riley Scott. I write lesbian romance published by Bella Books. I have 5 standalone novels currently out. My latest, On the Rocks, came out in March. And my first young adult title, Take Your Shot, will be out early next year. I've written everything from coming out stories to well-established queer characters, and really just aim to write strong female characters who are tackling issues in life and discovering their journeys to mental health while also falling for equally strong women.
Great.
Sweet.
So we all write in a variety of genres, but representation matters across the board. So how do you write relatable characters that also provide realistic queer representation? Do you want to start us off, Meredith?
Sure. Yeah. You know, no matter how much as a writer I want my characters to be, my protagonists particularly, to be heroes, like I want that so bad, and because that's what I'm reading for a lot of times too, like for that kind of a thing. But I always keep forgetting that they're human, right? And that they make mistakes, and that those mistakes are actually the things that make them grow. So one of my downfalls as a writer is I tend to write my characters either all good or all bad. And those binaries, like we know just from living in life, is they're not accurate. And so it's one of the things that I really have to watch out for in terms of realistic. So I think that what I try to focus on, rather than the good or the bad, that they have a really big problem that they're having to solve. And that helps me to keep my characters realistic.
MB?
I pull from a lot of real people that I know and observe. I'm in my 50s now, so I've been in larger queer communities for decades, which means I've met all kinds of people who fit under this really broad umbrella of queer individuals, and they're all really different and really nuanced, and they have intersectional identities. They're not, just queer people. They're also people of color and people with disabilities and people whose identities fall into all kinds of areas. So I really find that the way that they're relatable is that they act like, sound like, look like, behave like people I've actually known in real life. I might be compositing some of those traits into one person, or, picking and choosing and adding them someplace else. But everything that you see in a book, somebody would really do in some setting.
Relatable characters, I think one of the most important things, as others have touched on, is to have a character with flaws, because we all have them, and that's what makes us identify with a protagonist of a novel, for instance. And, I really find that in my books, at least, though the protagonists and many of the characters are queer, the situations are basically the same as in any other book. I have this just this context where sexual orientation isn't an issue. It's just accepted as part of the universe. And in that way, I think that the characters are relatable because, we're all essentially the same in that regard. One situation I'm currently in, which is where the sexual orientation is definitely part of the character's situation, is the work in progress that I have now. I've got a private investigator who needs to go undercover. And part of her undercover assignment is to cultivate a relationship with a man in order to gain some information. And so she's able to, with, a lot of reluctance, she's able to do the flirting, she's able to do the dating. But as happens, the pressure is now growing for her to have sex with this undercover assignment person. And so I'm having fun. I can make it a little comic, but it's also a very real thing this is, in essence, one of the things that makes us queer is we don't sleep with the opposite sex. So that one's kind of fun to write. And relatability, I think, also can concern likability. So likability, I think, is a whole different topic, perhaps, but those flaws that make us human can also make us unlikable. So it's really walking a tightrope between making a flawed character but not making them too flawed. And so those are some of the considerations I work with when I'm writing characters.
And, I mean, I write science fiction, so I wouldn't say that I'm an optimist, but I would say I'm a hopefulist. And so the universe I write in, orientation isn't an issue, but I will often address it metaphorically through the other struggles that the characters are facing. There are still human rights issues going on. They aren't those issues, but they are still human rights issues. How do I make them relatable? Very similar to what everyone else has said. I focus a lot on the emotional storyline. So I've always got three going on. I've got, your action storyline, I've got your romance storyline, and I've got an internal struggle going on as well with the main character. And while the action is probably something that people can't relate to too much because, it's lasers and spaceships and aliens and all of that fun stuff, I would hope that readers would be able to identify with the romance and the building attraction. And I hope they would also be able to identify with the character's internal struggles. In the Stormfront series, my main character struggles a lot with self-esteem issues. She doesn't feel that she's worthy of being loved. She's not sure that she should have human rights because she's not really sure anymore that she's entirely human since she's somewhat of a cyborg. And, take that wherever you want metaphorically, but I think that it's helpful to readers as she grows to more love and understand herself, and realizes that she is entirely worthy of love and being given human rights, that I would hope that people would embrace that and see where I'm trying to go with it.
Awesome. I think those are great responses, and I relate to a lot of what you all are saying. I think that much like MB, I people watch a lot. I take time to really try to figure out who people are, what their motivations are, what makes them tick. And I have a very diverse group of friends and acquaintances, and sometimes just random people I see on the street that I try to figure out, what it is they're doing and why that motivation is there. And so I think that, that looking at it from that multidimensional angle, like Meredith said, none of us are all good or all bad. We're all flawed. We're all some mix of the good and the bad. Sometimes our characters are going to react poorly. Sometimes they're not going to make the right decision. And so I think just trying to combine all of that into making them actually take on lives of their own. And as far as writing queer characters, we're multidimensional creatures just like everyone else. So I think it's, really providing that realistic representation. And for me, writing romance, conveying those flawed characters, learning how to have those healthy and loving relationships. Mm-hmm. So we've kind of touched on it some, but what challenges do you run up against in creating your characters? And are there some characters that are easier to develop? Elle, you want to kick us off?
Sure. I struggle sometimes with making both of my female protagonists strong in their own ways. So, obviously the one who's kicked butt and she's out there defeating the enemy and she's having all the battles, she's going to come across as physically strong, but you can tell that on the outside she's strong and on the inside she's a hot mess. Whereas her supporting character role, the secondary lead, I want to make sure that she's coming across just as strong, but in a different way. I want to show that you don't have to be beating everybody up to be strong. Maybe you have a much better grasp of empathy or understanding or science or psychology than anyone else. And you use that to your advantage and show that you are mentally and emotionally strong where the other character is struggling. And I always have to make sure that I've got that balance, because it's really easy to let the kick butt character take over. And of course, I adore her a lot. And so I have to make sure I'm keeping them equally powerful so that they can be there for each other.
I think all characters are difficult to develop if I'm doing my job correctly. I need to give my main character really thorough thought before I get her into the heart of the story. And part partly that's done through, I write a complete backstory for my character, and that backstory, maybe 10% of it might make it into the novel, but it gives me their story, their motivation, what they like, what they don't like, what scares them, are they brave, just all kinds of aspects of their characters, so that once I start writing, it actually tends to come more intrinsically to me if I've done that upfront work. I think any main character or secondary character deserves the same kind of work up front. I think very minor characters are easy enough to include, but you have to make sure they're not cardboard cutouts. So even the most minor of characters has to have something that makes them stand out on the page, I think. I think the most difficult character I've developed was the character of Claire in my most recent release, Money Creek, because Claire is a drug addict. And, we've got the considerations of making relatable, likable characters. And this just was really hard to do with a drug addict who basically the storyline is her sabotaging her own life to a degree that kicks off all kinds of action and drug lords and, all kinds of stuff going on. But really what's the essence of the story is her continuing to make bad decisions until she ultimately makes a good decision. And I got feedback as I was writing, and the feedback was, she's not so likable. So I had to really work on that. And I think I pulled it off. I'm not 100% sure. Elle says yes. Yeah. But she gave me fits where no other character kind of took me to that degree of having to figure out their character, and also figure out their character vis-a-vis the reader. I think, as writers, it's a good idea to not write specifically for your audience. I mean, not to have that in your head the whole time, but you have to consider it also. And that's what I found myself doing with Money Creek. I just wanted to touch on one more thing about the likability of characters, because this maybe has to do more with male, female than queer or not queer, but I think it applies to queer characters as well, is that, the price is high with a queer character or female character for their flaws. So in other words, male characters throughout literature are flawed and often do appalling things, and we're still expected to be there with them throughout the course of a book. Whereas with women and with queer characters, their flaws tend to detract from the character, I think, in the eyes of the general reading public, not my eyes, but so it's, there's actually a podcast called Unlikable Female Characters, which deals with that whole thing. And I think, queer characters certainly carry that as well.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot with what Anne said. It is difficult to create really strong secondary characters that are different and have their own personality and their own character to themselves. But one of the things that I will say is that sometimes I think it's easier, at least for me, the voice that usually comes to me first is the protagonist, and that's usually who I work with first. But sometimes it is a little bit easier for me to work with my secondary characters because they have a job to do. And particularly in crime writing, that job is to deliver a clue of some kind that pushes the detective or the investigator or whoever onto the next breadcrumb, right? So that job is really, really important. And sometimes the way that I work with secondary characters is really focusing on that job and then building their personality a little bit after that, because I need them to do a very specific thing. So for instance, in the book that I'm working on now, that I just finished up, has a coroner who has this very big personality. He's like a jokester, very funny. He makes all kinds of dead jokes. He's very hilarious. But he has a very specific job. Like his whole job in the novel is to look at a body, say how that body got in that death position, right? And exactly how exactly how that happened, to give clues to my detective, who can then take those elsewhere. But he's also a funny guy, which is a little contradictory to what we think of coroners as being too. So, but for me, it was easier for me to sort of develop, I knew what he had to say and I knew what he had to direct, right? And then build the personality kind of out from there. So sometimes secondary characters, I guess what I'm saying, are easier for me than, I mean, the protagonists are so multifaceted, and so there's so much to them that sometimes it's a relief a little bit to work with a secondary character.
Yes.
Yeah.
MB?
I would agree that the supporting cast are a lot easier for me. I do spend time researching who they are, what their backstory is, that sort of stuff, if they're important supporting characters. But my main characters, the ones where you see the world through their eyes and you hear their thoughts and their internal feelings and what's really driving them, those are the ones where I worry the most about verisimilitude. Not making them 100% realistic, but really believable. And that's the challenge, is that I only have so much life experience, and my slice of what I've experienced is pretty narrow. So I have to do a lot of research if my protagonist is going to be not like me, which for the Manji Rios series, really the biggest challenge, she's part Latina and she's part Iranian and she's a Brooklynite and she speaks a lot of languages and she has black belts that I never earned. And none of that worried me as much as the fact that she's a soldier and a woman in special forces. And I really wanted to make sure that part was right, that her mindset was right, that the way that she approaches life was like the women soldiers I have known, and honored them by being realistic enough. I didn't want her to be in any way a cardboard cutout or a bad reflection on their reality. So the challenge there is really doing enough research and talking to enough people who have lived that life, that aspect at least it was good. And that is, where I get the good feedback, is that, I recognize myself in that character. I'd like to be more like that character. And when I hear that from women who have served, I'm like, oh, good. Thank God I did the research. And the other characters, of course, much, much easier because, as Meredith said, they have a role to play. You can really focus on what they're doing more than what they're thinking, and how and where that comes from and whether it's realistic.
I agree with a lot of that. For me, I think I am both a researcher and a pantser by nature. And those come into play really, really in my character development. Whether it's my main character or my secondary character, I'm going to research everything I can. If their profession's something that I can try for a day, I'm going to try. If I can interview, if I can shadow, my latest one was a bar owner, but she was creating her own craft cocktails. So I spent months, really experimenting with different flavors and different spirits and different techniques and creating an entire line of these craft cocktails just to figure out how that process worked. And so I will
like hardship there. That
oh, yeah. It was really difficult. Sometimes research is fun. But then I find that for me, my characters work best. The character development works best when I really let that character take over and what they would do naturally. I find that the characters I have the hardest time developing are those that I want to do something exactly. And I think that's, my pantser nature. I have places I want them to end up, but how they get there is really just tuning into that, who they are, what their individual quirks, weaknesses, strengths, and how they would react in certain situations. I find that my writing and my characters struggle a lot when I try to outline it in my process. So,
Mhm.
So one thing that I know I've personally struggled with, and that we've talked about a little bit, but what's one of the main challenges of writing relationship or dialogue scenes between two women as it relates to utilizing she pronouns and making sure there's not confusion there? MB, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'm just going to say it's giving them distinct enough voices that if you took all the dialogue tags away, you'd still know who was talking. And I think that's a really good practice for anybody, regardless of what kinds of characters they're writing, is you want to really be able to feel in the way that they express their thoughts, whether it's internal thoughts or external thoughts, which character that is. Yeah, so that's really my, if I can read through and ignore all the tags and still know who's doing what, then I feel like I've hit it. And if I can't, it doesn't matter how many times I put in she or the name of the character or they or the name of the character. It's just missing something if they're not distinct enough.
I'd like to jump in that one too. It's, I think it's easier when you're writing a series too, because by the time, even in the first book, by the time you're a good quarter of the way through, one would hope that the reader would have a solid grasp of the kinds of things that your two main characters would and would not say. And of course, as that goes on, it will become even more distinctive as your readers learn about and get to know those characters. So you might find yourself using names more frequently in the very beginning, because like anyone else, you've got to meet somebody and you've got to get to know them and what to expect from them. Action tags also, having an action immediately before and after helps a lot, because they're things that my action character would do that my other character would never be able to do. If a character's cursing, it's probably Vic. And if the character's being real sweet and warm, it's probably Kelly. Although they will flip occasionally. It's, if you're doing the job right, then once the reader's a bit into it, they're going to know with or without, just like MB said, with or without those tags, which character it probably is.
Of course, I agree about the dialogue tags. I think the less is more there entirely. Where it gets really difficult is when the two women are getting physical with each other, because here you're not using dialogue tags, and the tension is, if I use the she or her pronoun too often, then you lose sight of what's going on, who's doing what. If you use their proper names too much, it just sounds awkward. It's just, so that's just difficult. I don't know. There's no answer to it. You just have to kind of, accept that a certain amount of it is going to be more awkward than when you're using differing pronouns. I also think there's, other challenges with developing queer relationships and dialogue. And, I have, in my current work in progress, the two women, there's a romantic subplot, and the two women know pretty early on that, that this is something that's serious and that, is going to last longer than the current crisis they're in. And I actually had somebody in my writing group say, God, they're getting together so quickly. And part of that stems from, my life as a lesbian. I hate to go to a stereotype, but, there's a lot of times where women know pretty early on. And, a lot can be said about that, I think women tend to think about the relationship in home and nesting and all of that much earlier than men do. And so you put two women together and it's exponentially true. So I make that ask in my books that you kind of go with me on that. And I think, the other things about developing relationships through dialogue and other things is really just a craft issue, that it's not necessarily a queer issue, that and everyone's been touching on this, that the most important thing to do is to show and not tell. So this is it's a concept that actually takes a while to fully appreciate, but essentially you want to get rid of as many of the internal thoughts as possible. I don't want to write out, I felt so attracted to so-and-so. I want to show that the attraction is there. And that can be done through a gazillion different techniques. I mean, a scene of bright, witty dialogue can really indicate the attraction between two people. The spark is there, and just various reactions and such can show what a character is thinking instead of telling them. So that's always a challenge when writing. So that's it.
Yeah, I would just echo what all of you are saying. It is really, really hard to do. And the more that you can show, the better, is usually the way that I go with that too. And I try to also use objects as something that represents something else maybe with the relationship, so that it takes away from some of the heavy dialogue with building relationships. And now we can use so many different modes of communication, right? Like they can be texting each other. Like there's different ways that people can communicate that don't necessarily have to be just having a conversation. So sometimes that helps to mix it up as well too.
I'd like to toss one more thing in there also, and that's not all of them, but many of my books are first person, and so that really helps when you're dealing with two people of the same gender. Is if one of them's I, and whose point of view you're in, then that eliminates 50% of the problem right there.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I think you all hit the nail on the head there. I think one of the things, Anne was saying, show, don't tell. And I think that that's probably one of the hardest lessons that we learn and then relearn, and then through 75 series of edits, we relearn again. But I think that especially in those scenes, it really does fall into having those two distinct personalities and really, but also making sure that the readers can see what you can. I know, especially in my early writing, I struggled with, it was all up here. And so getting that to translate on the page, having someone else read it, reading it out loud. And if it's unclear, then if there's any question, then it needs to be revised. So, So have you included queer characters who don't represent your queer identity? And if so, how do you make sure that you're providing an accurate representation?
I've done that. I don't know if you want me to start.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. All right. Well, I've included, I have gay male characters in some of my work and in my latest book too. And so one of the things that I've done, I have gay male friends who I run scenarios by, talk to them about it. If I'm really concerned, I will have them read a chapter or two just to make sure that it rings true. In one of my earlier books, I actually had one of my gay male friends read the entire draft just to make sure everything was okay. So those are some of the things that I've done.
I've also included a gay male couple in the Stormfront series, although they are supporting characters. Being bisexual, one of my characters is almost always bisexual, the other is lesbian. I'm fortunate in that both my publishers are LGBTQ presses. And so my editors run the gamut, transgender, bisexual, and gay male. I've got 3 editors that go through everything I do. My agent is bisexual and non-binary. So I know that eyes are getting on my work. that are probably going to catch, or at least hopefully going to catch, problematic things. I'm not going to say that we never mess up, because it's human, but we certainly try very, very hard to represent accurately.
I'm with Meredith. I've written gay male characters, and my number one thing is to try to avoid stereotypes, and that's just a good byword for everything. I want to include trans characters in my books, and hope to with the next book, but I definitely would need a sensitivity reader or somebody to coach me, because I feel I'm a little out of my depth there. No matter what my empathies are, I'm not living that experience, and it's an extraordinary one. So, but my world is pretty lesbian, so perhaps I should branch out a little bit more.
Yeah. My world is also somewhat narrow, but it's just that I'm a cis bi woman who's been married for a long time to another cis woman. And that, that's just a tiny little slice of this big overarching set of identities that we have under the queer community. It's really, there aren't enough letters in the alphabet to string together now that we've got LGBTQIA, A plus. I mean, the plus is really kind of where everything gets fuzzy, because people are aware now that they have so many more choices about how they identify, and you can't put all of them on the page in any one story. And you don't want to sort of just like diversity stuff your writing in any aspect of your characters' identities. But you also want to reflect the world that exists. For me right now, writing the work in progress that is set in this year on and near a college campus, I've got young people, who are like 19, and my point of view character is as much like me as I could make her, because that saves me a great deal of work on my point of view character. But I have to do a lot of work to try to get the representation of the young people in particular right, because they've come up in an entirely different world than I am, and they're using words and their own perception of identity and their willingness to be labeled or not labeled and what they think it means. And all of that is really different from sort of my own upbringing and worldview. And I've been an observer. But to get representation right, I'm going to need a lot of different beta readers on this one. There's no way around it.
I would agree with all of that. I have written gay male characters and bisexual women, and as a cis lesbian, I look at it and I want to always make sure that those are authentic portrayals. Fortunately, I do have a large group of queer friends that I can run things by, that I can ask questions to, and really, share excerpts, make sure this is accurate. Fortunately for one of my gay male characters, he was heavily modeled off of someone I know, so it worked out well. But I think we have a question from the audience.
I think we have 3.
All right. How do you develop ideas for your characters and plots? Who wants to kick it off?
I'll start. In some ways, for me, that's the great unknown. I don't know exactly how an idea drops into my head. Sometimes it drops into my head fully formed, and I don't know where it comes from. But other times, I've read many times from many authors that the most important question you can ask yourself is, what if? So if you take note of a situation in life and it interests you, and you ask the question, well, what if this and what if that? And you can develop a pretty intricate plot just based on that genesis right there. Years ago, I wrote a short story about a young woman who was riding her motorcycle to Chicago to be in the gay games. And the story was inspired by a newspaper article I had read about a man who was riding his motorcycle through Iowa, hit something in the road, and flew off of the motorcycle into a cornfield. And it just, I don't know why that struck me, but I wrote this whole story about this woman ending up in the cornfield and being rescued by the local sheriff, and much happens in between. So you can find storylines in the news, from friends, it's really, I think writers develop observational skills. And I mean, my wife is always telling me that I make up stories. So I'll look at somebody that I see and I've made up a whole story about what their situation is. So there's kind of a constant generation of ideas and personalities and things that you can eventually fit into a novel.
I consume media, mostly books, but sometimes television and film, along the lines of the kind of thing that I write, and I do it constantly. I read maybe 3 books a week or more, just because I love it. And also it keeps that creative brain kind of going, because I'll think, well, that's kind of cool the way that author did that, but I would have done blah, blah, blah. And I guess my imagination is a little overactive when I sleep, because I'll go to sleep, wake up the next morning, and I've got entire plots in my head. I've got characters and character names. Sometimes I have bits of dialogue. And usually I've got a beginning, a middle, and an end. I might not know how they all fit together, but I've got a solid idea of what I could do with it. And I think it's just overloading my brain with the kinds of things that I really enjoy writing, and letting my brain take them in a bunch of other directions.
I'm probably I am definitely, I would say, a true crime addict. Like, I love it. I can't get enough of true crime podcasts, the shows, I just, I have the ID channel on most of the time. So I'm always looking for like something a little bit different in a crime that might spark an idea for how something could go in a book. So my crimes are based on like a germ of something that has happened in real life, in a real case. And then I expand it into something that's a little bit different, that is specific to the particular characters I'm working with. But kind of like what Elle's saying, like when you feed that part of yourself, whether it's reading or whether it's listening or watching, then your brain, it's almost like a Rubik's Cube, like flipping and flipping and flipping until you get the right combination of something that can work. And so that's how I definitely get them.
Yeah. My inspirations have come from all different areas depending on what it is I end up writing. I mean, for the Maji thrillers, a real life people that I met, young women who had served in Iraq and come back with combat experience, and in their civilian settings, nobody ever guessed that they had been combat soldiers, like recently or ever. You just people just were always like looking over them, and their idea of soldier was not what these women were. And that gave me the concept right there for like, well, wouldn't they be the ideal covert operators, because women are overlooked everywhere. And then I started to, look into money laundering and how that relates to terrorism. And again, the Rubik's Cube started to fall together at that point and become a story. For the steampunk, on the other hand, there was a lot of discussion about why is all steampunk set in Victorian England and all upper class stuff and white people and really boring. So it got me thinking about where in the world would it be interesting to set a story it's sort of at the cusp of the Industrial Revolution, and who would the characters be, and what kinds of adventures would they get up to, and what challenges would they have? And let's take gender out of the equation and have a egalitarian society, and what kind of conflict would there be there? And so all those pieces started to accrete. And for the current one, really, it was just, I was tired of the pandemic, and one of my neighbors started telling me about Titus Andronicus, which is, if you haven't read it, don't. Probably Shakespeare's worst, grossest, ickiest revenge play. One of his first, just strictly written to write money. But there's all this chopping off of heads and baking them in pies and stuff. And, I was revolted by the concept, and it just at a snapback kind of said, oh, that needs a companion cookbook. And that got me thinking, like, who would actually think that was funny enough to run with it? And where would they live and that sort of stuff? And this is why we have college students doing a cookbook and a web cooking series and a murder in the mix and some serious themes about, pandemic and racial justice and other relevant things. But all that, it just started with those germs of an idea and then grew. Some ideas stick and some just sort of filter through.
I love the comparison of the Rubik's Cube. That's, such a great way to look at it. And I think that's, I draw inspiration from a number of sources, from entertainment, from watching people, from pretty much everything that's happening around. I have one that I'm going to work on soon that it's the first time I've ever had a dream that was, I have vivid dreams a lot, but it was the first time I had a dream that really was just, that'll be the greatest book that I could do at this moment. And so I think there's inspiration everywhere. Sometimes I fall down research rabbit holes and then find myself wondering, what would a day in the life of someone doing this profession be like? And sometimes that just gets the ball rolling. So I think it's a variety of sources. And I think we have another audience question. All right. What messages, if any, do you hope your novels extend to the audiences, both queer and non-queer?
I'll start. I think the main message that I want to convey is similarity, or really that there is no huge difference between queer and straight. You find in a novel that the concerns are pretty much the same. A character still asks themselves the same questions, am I loved? What am I doing here? So, oh my God, I completely lost my train of thought there. Well, yeah, what were we talking about? Oh, so, I guess when I first started reading lesbian fiction, this was in the 70s, and things were very different. And, people were closeted, and there was, real danger outside the door if you were out, if you did any public display of affection or anything like that. And while those problems still exist, and they exist in varying proportions, I think, based on where you live and things like that. But basically, times have changed, and I like to imagine a world where it's not an issue. And as I say that, I realize that it could be skirting issues that I should be dealing directly with, but those issues like bullying or still being in the closet, things like that they just haven't come up in my novels. So I guess the short answer is the similarities far outweigh the differences. And so I think for the reading public, you're missing a lot of great literature by not reading queer literature, because I've been reading straight literature for a long time, and it's not particularly upsetting or anything like that. So
Yeah, I would say that I don't really have a message, but I definitely have a purpose. And I don't tend to do the issue stories because I'm going to leave those stories to the people who can tell them with authenticity. But I I write science fiction because I can write a world where it's accepted up front. It's not an issue at all. I also write in genre partially because people who just like science fiction are likely to pick up my work because it's science fiction and get an exposure to queer literature and the normalization of that and the proliferation of that might help acceptance of that. The same with the urban fantasy. There's some out there for sure, but it's not the same as it would be if I weren't writing queer characters. It's, you know, the more of it I think that people stumble upon or are exposed to, the more I think that they won't see it as an other at all. It'll just
Right.
be, you know, it'll just be more of.
When I write, I mean, mostly what I write is crime related. And I think that, like what you guys were saying about there's not being this much of a difference at all. But I also would like readers to get this sense of justice coming through mine too. Because for so long, queer real people and also characters have been the ones who have suffered in ways that have been so egregious and unfair. And, you know, I would hope that there would be some sense of feeling, even if it's long gone, like, I mean, the justice is coming very late, that there is some form of justice that's happening for my queer characters. I hope some of that comes through.
Yeah, and I would say for mine also, my messages aren't about queerness necessarily or about being queer. They're more about larger things. If there's, you know, a message or a theme embedded in various books, you know, doing another series where I have a hero who is a woman and is queer, but also more importantly, sort of for the larger theme, is that she doesn't like to kill people. Her heroism is not about doing violence to counteract violence. It's about finding ways that are non-violent to use force and other tools to extinguish violence or prevent it. So it's sort of a different way of coming at the action hero trope. You know, if the what if is, you know, what if you had an action hero who didn't like solve problems by shooting everybody? That's more of the message of those. And I think the current one I'm working on is going to be fairly similar, since we're dealing with people with a lot of grief and rage about who's behaved badly in the last few years with American politics and social behavior, and what's okay to say and do and not, and what really hurts people and what doesn't, the lines between free speech and action, all of that sort of stuff. That's all thematic. It's not like a single message about, oh, here are these people and you should recognize them as whatever. They're just, you know, my characters are queer because that's who I relate to, and that's who you're going to see the world through, and the messages that you get are going to be what they've absorbed, that I've absorbed, and it's going to come through different characters in different ways.
I would say I've written both sides of it. I've written coming out stories where it is an issue, and I've also written queer stories where the characters are just queer, and that's how it is. I think a lot of that stems from personally where I grew up, how I grew up, and the difficulties that I faced in that, even in very, very recent years. Grew up in a very, very small conservative area of the world. And I was inspired at first to write those because I wanted the representation that I needed when I was younger. And so I think that, you know, the message in those is, you know, you're valid, you're loved, you're enough exactly as you are, and falling in love is beautiful no matter the gender. And so I think that was really, you know, my early writing. And then as I've gotten older and, you know, kind of matured in my writing as well, I think that, you know, all of them have their own message and theme and things that I think are important to show through the story. So I think it really varies for me. So, and I think we have one final question that we can speak on briefly. So how do you incorporate real life problems in your story, such as not being able to show affection in public? I think, that's, some of my early stuff very much had those real life problems and those difficulties that in some areas of even, in our nation, it's still very difficult for two women to have that affection in a safe manner. So I think I've done some incorporating of that, and I've done some where it's not so much an issue. So
the only one I could say that I've really touched on, and it's not out yet, the urban fantasy series that's coming, the middle book, the character is threatened with loss of her job because she's lesbian. And, up until, I think it's off the books now, but it's very recent here in Florida that you can be fired for that. And this book is set a few years ago. So she ends up essentially blackmailing them into allowing her to keep her job, which may not be the best way that she could have handled it, but it's the way that she has at hand at the time. And I haven't received editorial feedback on that yet. So I'm going to make sure that I handle it correctly, because it's not, of course, something I've had to personally deal with, but that is one that I do take on.
And I'll say for the...
Oh, sorry.
Okay,
go ahead,
I'll be
Lindy.
very quick. In my current work in progress, my main character would be characterized by someone as masculine of center. She looks butch. She wears a fedora. She's often absurd in public. People mistake her for a guy. And so I would say that is the real life problem that I'm taking on in this one, and not, doing it to do a message. But just by showing what her life is like and what she runs into and how that affects how she moves in the world, it is tackling that.
I think an interesting real life situation to deal with, and I might do this in a story or next novel, it's kind of the anti-romance, but divorce. We're still in many ways celebrating the ability to get married, but divorce is the natural aftermath of that for probably 50% of the people. That's what the goings. Actually, that would be really interesting to see what the percentages are for two women as opposed to straight marriages. But I kind of wonder, if I were in that situation, God forbid, but would I, feel in some way that I'm letting the team down? Here I've got, the ability to marry, and now I'm kicking it aside. I think that probably would be something that, right after divorce was legalized, marriage was legalized, would be more of an issue than it is as we get farther from the event. But that's one that comes to mind for me.
In my first book, part of the book was written from a teenager's point of view. And that character, it was Luz Hansen. It's the same character that I've been working with, but it was flashing back to when she was a teen and was in her first relationship with another female. And a lot of it focused around ex-gay ministries. And so there was all kinds of pressure, like, not to be seen touching anyone or talking inappropriately with anyone else. And everyone was constantly watching them. And so there were all these scenes of them sneaking off and trying to find these places where they could be alone, and just to be alone, for even if it was just 5 minutes to be alone. And I remember thinking about how that desperation felt for those characters, that dying to just be alone for a minute. And how much touch means, right? When you can't touch someone, how much it means when you can. And so, that's where I've dealt with it the most, is with a younger character. Once my characters were older, it had more to do with work-related issues and things like that.
All right. Well, thank you all for tuning in with us. And I think that we are going to wrap it up now.
Thanks so much
Thanks
for coming.
watching. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to find out when we have new fun and informative videos for you. Orange County Library System is your place to learn, grow, connect.